Jon Shafer examines his personal journey through the development of At the Gates. Game developer and Civilization V lab designer Jon Shafer has shared a deeply personal post on his blog about his life during the development of his game At the Gates, offering an honest retelling of the toll indie development can take on a person and the complicated responsibilities and rationalizations of solo development. It's a story that will no doubt resonate with other game developers, both indie and AAA, and Shafer also shares his experiences as a sort of cautionary tale to other game developers, with the goal of giving fellow devs advice and encouragement to avoid or rather the same complications and pressure he saw during At the Gates' 7-year development. But in addition to a harrowing retelling of those darkest and most difficult moments, Shafer shares how he worked to turn his life around. First through small changes and focusing on overcoming seemingly small hurdles, one at a time. And while we often hear about stories of burnout, rarely are those made totally real for us. It's always something at a distance, something impersonal, shares Shafer. In this article I hope to pull back the curtain and show how bitterly dark it can be behind the public veneer. There were many moments where I did giving up on everything and saw no future for myself, none whatsoever. I am thankful now that I did not give up, because I came very close. Nexon founder Jung-ju is reportedly looking to sell a 65% controlling stake in the company's holding firm NXC Corp for around $8.9 billion, as reported by Reuters, while the Korean Economic Daily shares in the Tokyo-based video game company, which operates various popular mobile and PC titles like MapleStory and Dungeon Theater, online jumped by around 30% following the news. The company has also helped bring a number of popular franchises like Need for Speed, Final Fantasy FIFA, and Counter-Strike to the South Korean market. Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank have seemingly been brought in to manage the sale, and there's reported interest from potential buyers, including Kakao Corp Netmarble EA, and Tencent. Like so much in game dev, the decision to use procedural generation in your game is a double-edged sword. While it provides a theoretically unlimited amount of content, user-graphics of advantages of your game being bespoke and handcrafted. The goal, then, is to craft tools that can turn out procedural content in near infinite quantities and configurations while making that content feel as close to homemade as possible. To explore some different approaches to that problem, Gamasutra reached out to a number of devs with experience working with procedural tools and asked about how they felt about different methods of content generation, and how they avoid making procedural content that feels banal and recycled. First and most obvious is the question of why choose procedural content in the first place. For Kitfox Games, Tanya X, co-editor of the book Procedural Generation in Video Games, the answer is simple: it's just more interesting. It's a way to build something that even its creator does not fully recognize. Procedural content and handmade content each have their own strengths and weaknesses. To me, the main difference is that I enjoy creating procedural content far more as a designer, because my creation has more opportunities to surprise me. For just among of subset games who utilizes procedural content, both in their breakout hit for us, well as their new title Into the Breach, it's not necessary to exclusively choose one or another, either procedural or handmade. Both approaches to content creation have a place in the games world. and both can lead to great results if executed well. Moses, speaking as a player of games, I am generally less interested in completely linear games that test if you can achieve the goals laid forth by a designer exactly how they intended you to play. I am much more interested in exploring dynamic systems that give the player a lot of leeway to express themselves. However, the most compelling games to me often use both procedural and handmade content. The key focus is always to ensure that at the end you have a product that's engaging and fun. Above all other considerations, procedural content, properly deployed, can help with that. You could simulate complex procedural systems that are amazing from a technical perspective, but if they are not aiding in making the game enjoyable, it's kind of a waste. For example, we found that heavily restricting the procedural generated elements was necessary to make into the bridge battles less frustrating. Instead, we relied on creating simple mechanics that can interact with each other in a variety of interesting and dynamic ways. That solution is a perfect illustration of how bespoke and randomly generated content are not necessarily oppositional, and can actually be used to amplify each other's strengths. Within To the Breach, we found that the amount of fun you do have with the game was highly dependent on where enemies stood in relation to their environment. If an enemy is in a corner, attacking a building, it's much more likely that you will be unable to neutralize the threat without causing collateral damage to the buildings. Continues Mode. This feeling of having no potential solution was unacceptable to us, so it became clear that we would need to create environments that would minimize the chances of this happening. The types of problematic terrain configurations was quite varied, so we eventually decided that we could not rely on procedural generation of maps. Instead, we opted to manually design the basic layout of each map and use procedural generation for less important aspects of maps, such as forests and sand locations, as well as elements that were unique to specific missions, such as where key structures were spawned. The result was a lot of variety of maps, while avoiding problematic layouts as much as possible. However, if you play enough, you will likely start recognizing key features. Zabir Hoque, an engineer at Customary Softworks, whose 2016 release Astroneer leans heavily on procedurally generated elements, agrees that the best results are often produced when procedural and bespoke content is married together. Generally, handmade content allows for a level of polish that is very hard to replicate with an entirely procedural system. Hoque says, the goal with procedural content is to provide novelty, but we want some level of familiarity, so the player is not just experiencing chaos. Artists and designers can be extremely convincing, and building procedural systems that can match that level of care and quality can be quite hard. That being said, having procedural systems enables scenarios that would otherwise be impossible. For instance, in the case of Astroneer, creating varying game planets that provide alternate experiences each playthrough. In generating the landscapes of Astroneer, Hoque and his team use handmade assets as landmarks to break up procedural content and make the whole seem less random and unfamiliar. They treat these handmade pieces as having an area of influence that extends around them into the procedural content and influences it in terms of player experience. For Hoque, building procedural tools is not just a way to save labor or reduce the amount of artistic content required to build a game. Quite the contrary, it's a way to empower artists. From a technical side, I think the most important thing to consider when building procedural systems, is how to allow for artistic control at various authoring levels. Hoque explains, you want to allow for authoring a rule set for general use cases, and then provide enough vectors of configuration so users can exercise artistic control when needed. And Hoque echoes most sentiments about ensuring that the final product is entertaining and enjoyable, about serving the player first. With our terrain system, we could just use Perlin noise everywhere in the terrain with random values and say, look, it's different every time. But this is what leads to a feeling of bland repetition. Instead, we try to think of how the player will play the game, and when they will seek out novelty. And that is where we try to introduce variation. Once you have landed on procedural generation,